Origins. In 1965, a 17-year-old Tony Iommi lost the tips of his middle and ring fingers in a sheet metal factory press accident. Bone exposed. Career apparently over. Instead of giving up, he melted washing up liquid bottles, wrapped them in leather, and created crude prosthetic fingertips. He couldn't feel the strings anymore, couldn't bend notes properly, so he started tuning down to reduce string tension and leaned hard into thick, heavy power chords instead of complex solos. A workplace accident in a Birmingham factory accidentally invented doom metal. I've thought about that a lot. The entire trajectory of heavy music altered forever because a teenager couldn't afford to stop working. There's something about that origin story that feels completely appropriate for a genre built on weight and struggle. Doom metal didn't come from privilege or conservatory training. It came from limitation, adaptation, and stubbornness. That's been its DNA ever since. Before Black Sabbath, San Francisco's Blue Cheer were already pushing amplification to its breaking point. Their 1968 album Vince Bus Eruptum is not a comfortable listen. Marshall amps cranked to maximum. Feedback treated as melody. Distortion so thick it almost collapses under its own weight. Their cover of Summertime Blues took a lighthearted Eddie Cochran tune and made it sound like the song was being played inside a collapsing building. I've put this record on for people who consider themselves open-minded about heavy music and watch them physically recoil. It wasn't quite doom metal yet, but it was the first proof that heaviness itself could be the entire point. Not a side effect, not an accident, the destination. Then came February 13th, 1970. Black Sabbath's self-titled debut hit the UK, and the opening track changed everything. The song opens with rain and church bells, then drops into one of the most ominous riffs ever recorded. A tritone interval played at glacial tempo on heavily distorted guitar. The tritone had been called Diabolus in musica for centuries. The devil's interval, avoided in Western music because it sounded inherently wrong and unsettling. Bassist Geezer Butler specifically cited Gustav Holst's Mars, the Bringer of War as inspiration. They were building horror movie atmosphere with rock instruments. If you've never put on headphones and listened to that opening riff in a dark room, do it before you watch another video on this channel. I'm serious. It doesn't matter that you've probably heard it 100 times. There's something in those first 30 seconds that still doesn't feel entirely safe. That's not nostalgia. That's the riff working exactly as intended, 54 years later. But the genius wasn't intentional. It came from Iommi's limitations. Those prosthetic fingertips made traditional lead playing difficult, so he focused on massive chord-heavy riffs. By their third album, Master of Reality, in 1971, they downtuned to C# to make it even easier on his injured hand. That lower tuning became doom metal's sonic signature. Guitars tuned down, string tension reduced, everything sounding darker and heavier. What started as accommodation for a disability became the template for an entire genre. Geezer Butler's bass reinforced this by abandoning melodic runs and doubling Iommi's riffs instead, adding weight rather than counterpoint. The production was raw and compressed, but it captured what Butler called the bleak industrial nightmare of Birmingham. This wasn't party music. The lyrics dealt with war, occultism, and existential dread. Inspired by Butler's encounter with what he believed was a supernatural presence after reading a 16th century book on magic, I remember the first time I properly sat with Master of Reality front to back. Not as background music, actually sat with it. There's a kind of heaviness in that record that doesn't feel performed. It feels like it came from somewhere real. Birmingham in the late 1960s was a city defined by factory work, industrial decline, and limited options. Black Sabbath didn't write about that directly. They translated it into sound. And once you hear it that way, you can't unhear it. The underground. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Virginia, Bobby Liebling formed Pentagram and started writing doom songs that wouldn't get properly recorded for over a decade. They existed in parallel to Black Sabbath, but remained underground, producing brilliant material that almost nobody heard. Pentagram's story is honestly one of the saddest in metal. The quality was there from the beginning. The recognition wasn't. If you want to understand doom metal's complicated relationship with commercial success, start with Pentagram. Artistic excellence in this genre has never guaranteed anything except the respect of the people paying close enough attention. By the late 1970s, bands started consciously building on Black Sabbath's blueprint. Trouble formed in Chicago in 1979 and became the first major band to explicitly embrace the doom metal identity. They combined Sabbath's heaviness with psychedelic textures and, controversially, Christian lyrical themes that initially alienated them from the metal community. Their first two albums are worth your time specifically because of that tension. Heavy music carrying genuine spiritual conviction hits differently than heavy music carrying occult aesthetics as costume. Whether you share the belief or not, you can feel that Trouble meant it. Saint Vitus emerged from Los Angeles, influenced equally by Black Sabbath and the hardcore punk scene exploding around them. Guitarist Dave Chandler mixed Sabbath's darkness with punk's aggressive anti-establishment attitude, creating something that fit awkwardly in both worlds. When Greg Ginn from Black Flag signed them to SST Records, it established a pattern that would define doom for decades. The genre found its most reliable support not in metal's mainstream, but in underground communities that valued stubbornness over commercial sense. Britain's Witchfinder General brought a more guitar-centric approach on their 1982 debut, Death Penalty. Phil Cope's riffing balanced smooth bluesy passages with crushing heaviness, while the production stayed surprisingly clear, proving doom didn't need murky, lo-fi aesthetics to achieve its impact. This is an underappreciated record. If you've spent time with the obvious Sabbath catalog and want to understand where doom went next, Death Penalty is exactly where I'd send you. Then Candlemass dropped Epicus Doomicus Metallicus in 1986. The title alone announced the ambition. The Swedish band brought symphonic grandeur to doom, incorporating keyboards and progressive structures that elevated the genre beyond pure heaviness into something genuinely monumental. While thrash bands competed through velocity and technical proficiency, Candlemass proved you could achieve extremity through the exact opposite, playing slower, heavier, more deliberately. Messiah Marcolin's operatic vocals over those crushing riffs shouldn't work as well as they do. The fact that they work completely is one of doom metal's great unlikely victories. The explosion. The 1990s were doom metal's creative Big Bang. The genre didn't just evolve, it exploded. Funeral doom, death doom, sludge, stoner metal, variations nobody had imagined possible. Each subgenre took doom's fundamental DNA and pushed it somewhere completely different. And the most remarkable thing is that almost all of it worked. What happened when slow isn't slow enough? That was the question Finnish bands started answering in the early 1990s. And the answer was funeral doom. Thergothon's 1994 album Stream from the Heavens didn't just slow things down. It dissolved the concept of tempo almost entirely. 40 beats per minute. Songs built on atmosphere rather than structure. Vocals buried in the mix as texture rather than lyrical delivery. The first time I heard this record, I genuinely wasn't sure if it was music or something else entirely. It felt like ending a ceremony for something that hadn't happened yet. Skepticism, also Finnish, refined the approach further. Drummer Lasse Pelkonen wanted his drums to sound like orchestral mallets. The band used silence as a compositional tool. Entire passages where the guitars just sustained single droning notes for minutes. If you find yourself impatient with funeral doom, that's intentional. You're supposed to surrender to it, not conquer it. When Finland was dissolving tempo, Britain was drowning in grief. Winter's 1990 debut Into Darkness combined death metal's growled vocals and double kick drumming with crushing slow tempos, and pointed toward something new. But it was three bands from the north of England who turned that instinct into a fully realized movement. Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, and Anathema all signed to Peaceville Records, all operating within miles of each other. Essentially built death doom from the ground up between 1990 and 1993. Paradise Lost's Gothic proved the combination could achieve real commercial traction alongside artistic credibility. My Dying Bride added violins and Gothic romanticism. Anathema's Serenades incorporated atmospheric passages and female vocals that softened the brutality without removing it. What I find remarkable about this period is how much genuine grief exists in this music. Not performed grief, actual desolation. Gothic especially sounds like it was recorded by people who had given up on the idea that things get better. I went through a period in my early 20s where that record felt like the only honest thing I owned. I'm not sure that's a healthy relationship with an album. I'm also not sure it matters. That's what music is for. The Melvins, formed in Washington in 1983, are the reason Sludge exists, and they've never once gotten enough credit for it. They witnessed Black Flag perform in Seattle in 1984 and took one specific lesson from it. Punk energy doesn't require speed. It requires commitment. When Buzz Osborne and Dale Crowbar started deliberately dragging their tempos down into the mud, they created something that made hardcore kids uncomfortable and metal kids confused. Both communities eventually came around. It just took a while for everyone to catch up to what the Melvins already understood. Louisiana developed the most distinctive sludge scene, and honestly the most essential one. Eyehategod formed in 1990 when most Louisiana metal was chasing speed and technical proficiency. Their embrace of slowness and raw ugliness was a deliberate aesthetic rebellion. Their 1993 album Take As Needed for Pain is one of those records that sounds genuinely dangerous. Not dangerous like aggressive. Dangerous like something has gone wrong and nobody's coming to fix it. The production is unpolished. The vocals are confrontational. The whole thing sits in your chest differently than almost anything else in metal. Crowbar and Acid Bath reinforced Louisiana as Sludge's spiritual home, each band absorbing the state's particular cultural weight into their sound. Stoner metal asked a different question entirely. Not how slow or how heavy, but how deep into a riff can you actually go before it stops being a song and becomes something else? Sleep's 1992 Holy Mountain started exploring that territory, combining Sabbath-style heaviness with fuzz and phaser effects that created hypnotic, groove-laden riffing. But their true answer came in 1996 with Dope Smoker, a single 63-minute song about a caravan of weed-smoking pilgrims crossing the desert. On paper, that sounds like the most self-indulgent thing a band has ever attempted. And look, I understand if that description makes you want to run in the other direction. But here's the thing. If you gave Dope Smoker 40 minutes without interruption, something genuinely strange happens. The repetition stops feeling like repetition. The riff becomes less like a song and more like a weather system you're standing inside. I've heard people describe minute 45 as a kind of meditative state, and I used to think they were being pretentious. I don't anymore. It is simultaneously the most ridiculous and most transcendent thing Sleep ever recorded. And I mean both of those things completely sincerely. Kyuss took stoner doom somewhere more accessible, with 1992's Blues for the Red Sun. Desert rock, they called it eventually. The geographic specificity was real. Baking California heat pressed directly into the tone. The album's influence spread far beyond doom circles into mainstream rock's entire subsequent decade. Cathedral's 1991 debut, Forest of Equilibrium, proved traditional doom remained vital through all of this. Ex-Napalm Death vocalist Lee Dorian founded both the band and Rise Above Records, and that second part matters as much as the first. Rise Above became the infrastructure that kept traditional doom breathing when every major label had decided the genre didn't exist commercially. Think about what that actually means. Without Dorian deciding to build the machinery himself, a significant portion of the records we're talking about today either don't get made or don't get heard. Forest of Equilibrium itself is a suffocating, deliberately paced album that rewards patience in ways that still surprise me. But the label might be the more important legacy. Sometimes the most consequential thing a musician does isn't the music. The new millennium. The infrastructure Dorian built in the 1990s didn't just keep traditional doom alive. It gave the genre a foundation stable enough to actually grow on. And in the 2000s, for the first time, doom started finding an audience beyond the people who were already looking for it. Electric Wizard became traditional doom's new standard bearers through murky, heavy compressed production that recalled 1970s recording aesthetics while achieving maximum sonic crush. Their incorporation of occult themes from horror cinema created atmospheres of genuine menace. Are they overrated? Some people think so. I think Dope Throne is one of the heaviest records ever made, And I'll defend that position at length if you want to have that argument in the comments. Reverend Bizarre from Finland took a different approach, building extremity through duration rather than density. Songs routinely exceeding 20 minutes. Frontman Albert Witchfinder delivered vocals in a theatrical, vibrato-heavy baritone that evoked medieval sermons rather than conventional metal. They called it extreme traditional doom. That label is either completely absurd or perfectly accurate depending on your tolerance for commitment to a bit. I find it completely accurate, for what it's worth. Funeral doom kept moving. Australia's mournful congregation demonstrated the patience the subgenre demands, releasing music on their own timeline regardless of trends or commercial pressure. Germany's Ahab went somewhere nobody expected and built entire concept albums around 19th century maritime literature. Their 2006 debut, The Call of the Wretched Sea, adapted Moby Dick into Funeral Doom's glacial framework. And that sentence either sounds insane or immediately compelling to you. If it sounds insane, Funeral Doom is probably not your entry point into this genre. If it sounds immediately compelling, welcome. You found your people. Post-metal emerged as Doom's influence merged with progressive rock's ambition and noise rock's restlessness. Neurosis, Isis, and Cult of Luna created music that borrowed Doom's slowness and atmosphere while incorporating progressive structures and ambient depth. Post-metal's relationship to Doom has always been contested, and that argument is actually productive. It shows how much generative power Doom's fundamental characteristics carry when musicians treat them as starting points rather than destinations. Contemporary Doom. Contemporary Doom operates in a radically different landscape than Black Sabbath's industrial Birmingham. Bell Witch's 2017 Mirror Reaper, a single 83-minute composition, exemplifies what the genre has become. The Seattle duo, just bass and drums, sold 15,000 copies in the first year and hit #1 on Bandcamp's metal charts. No vocals, no conventional song structure, no label support. Just two musicians, the internet, and an audience that had grown far beyond underground tape traders. I want to be honest with you about Mirror Reaper. It's an endurance test. It's also one of the most emotionally complete listening experiences I've had with a piece of music in the last 10 years. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is kind of the whole point. Geographic diversification has accelerated into something genuinely exciting. Japan's Church of Misery combines traditional doom with crime-themed lyrics and groovy 1970s rock influences in a way that should not be as compelling as it is. Brazil's Jupiterian merges funeral doom with blackened atmospheres into something dense and suffocating, and worth every minute. Poland's Belzebong brings stoner doom filtered through Eastern European sensibilities that give it a different gravity than its California counterparts. What started in Birmingham and New Orleans is now a genuinely global conversation. And the regional variations aren't just cosmetic. Different places carry different weight. You can hear it. Contemporary doom still addresses darkness and despair, but the anxieties have evolved. Climate catastrophe, social collapse, political authoritarianism, all finding expression through crushing slow-motion dread. The methods are Sabbaths. The subject matter is 2024. The match is uncomfortable and completely appropriate. The genre that began with a teenager melting plastic bottles to replace severed fingertips has become something that would have seemed completely impossible to that 17-year-old in 1968. And I think about that sometimes. Not in a sentimental way, more like genuine disbelief that this is where limitation and stubbornness and refusal to quit actually led. Funeral doom's glacial tempos, death doom's aggressive synthesis, Sludge's punk metal collision, stoner metal's psychedelic grooves, all of it tracing back to one factory accident and one kid who couldn't afford to give up. 56 years later, with thousands of musicians across 6 continents still asking how slow and heavy it can possibly go, nobody has found the bottom yet. I hope they never do. I genuinely mean that.